All right, welcome back on this dark and stormy COVID-filled evening. My name is Matthew Belzer, and I'm going to be your instructor. Today's lecture is lecture 2 in our lecture series over the chapter 1 block. So we have the chapter 1 lecture block, and then we have 4 lectures embedded within. Today's lecture is going to focus predominantly on the idea of homeostasis. As always, I would have your lecture handout up and available, maybe online, so you can type out your notes or print it out and fill in your notes by hand, because that kind of helps you track with the lecture as we go through. So today we're going over homeostasis. And when you think about homeostasis, homeostasis is a metabolic balancing act. And I always like to draw an analogy. So look at this dude over here who's riding a unicycle across a tightrope, right? He has to balance everything perfectly in order to maintain that unicycle on that tightrope. And he's constantly adjusting his body position to do that. So if he starts tilting to the right, he'll adjust his balance stick to tilt back to the left, etc. And it's a delicate balancing act. And that's really what homeostasis is, and the maintenance of homeostasis is. It's a delicate balancing act, except instead of doing it on a tightrope, our body is doing it in relation to things like the external and internal environment. And 2, I just think that's a cool job. I wish I rode a unicycle across a tightrope for a living, and people would be like, "What do you do, man?" And I'm like, "I just ride a unicycle across a tightrope like 3 times a week, dude. I make 6 figures, bro." So when you think about defining homeostasis, and this is where we kind of step in with our follow along, homeostasis is the maintenance of a relatively constant or stable internal condition that's maintained by continuous adjustment. That's what homeostasis is. It's never that everything is exactly at one point. We're a system that's constantly fluctuating around what are called set points. And there are different factors that disturb or disrupt homeostasis all the time. You know, when you walk outside, temperature changes. Is it hot? Is it cold? When you put your head underwater, you're shifting oxygen concentrations in your body. Pathogens like COVID-19, remember that silly thing, right? Toxins in the environment, changes in your electrolyte composition because you're not drinking enough, whatever. There are tons of things that can disturb this delicate balance. And when you think about what death is defined as how death is defined as a prolonged inability to maintain homeostasis. Right? Deviations from homeostasis are what define disease. So our ability to maintain this relatively stable or constant internal condition is important. And there are factors at every level of organization that ultimately influence this. So when we think about homeostasis, it's a balancing act. I'm going to use terms like physiological parameters, physiological variables, physiological parameters, physiolocal variables, controlled conditions. Those are factors that our body maintains in relatively, narrow limits or narrow ranges. So blood glucose concentrations. I could call blood glucose concentrations a physiological parameter or a controlled condition or a physiological variable. I could call electrolyte, like sodium concentrations, a physiological parameter or a controlled condition or a physiological variable, right? Physiological parameters or controlled conditions are just factors that our body maintains within relatively narrow limits, and if we throw those off, it can have devastating downstream consequences. Now, how is homeostasis maintained? Homeostasis is maintained via what are called feedback mechanisms, and all feedback mechanisms have certain components in common. So when you think about this variable here, you see variable in homeostasis. That could represent anything. If we go back to this, it could represent body temperature, blood pressure, the concentration of glucose, electrolyte concentration, oxygen levels, anything that our body maintains within relatively narrow limits or narrow ranges, we refer to as being a physiological parameter or a controlled condition or a physiological variable. So this could represent anything. Let's call it temperature. A stimulus, for example, a change in temperature, disrupts this balance, and then that change has to be detected by a receptor. So whatever that stimulus is that disrupts this fine or delicate balance has to be detected by a receptor. That information then needs to go to a control center, which makes sense of that information and then outputs to an effector, and that effector ultimately triggers some kind of change that rebalances homeostasis. So all homeostatic pathways, all feedback pathways have those components in common. And we're going to look at a few different feedback pathways today. So let's look at how the maintenance of homeostasis is, let's look at an analogy for the maintenance of homeostasis using temperature regulation and how a thermostat works as an example. So when you think about the regulation of temperature, let's say you set your thermostat to 25 degrees Celsius, right? Now, your thermostat is set and you have your normal room temperature. Now, let's say that we live in Texas and room temperature rises, so we get an increase in the temperature in the room above the set point on that thermostat. Well, that increase in temperature has to be detected by a receptor. So the receptor that you find, peppered around your house in your systems that control temperature in your house is called the thermometer. And that thermometer is going to detect changes in temperature, and it's going to send that information to a control center, something that can ultimately make sense of what the change in information really means. And the control center in this case is a thermostat. And that thermostat can't change the temperature or regulate the temperature on its own. It needs an effector. In this case, the effector would be the air conditioning system. So the control center makes sense of that information. It says temperature is too low, and it activates an effector. The effector in this case is the air conditioner. It blows cold air out into the room, and when that cold air enters the room, the temperature drops back down until it hits the set point on the thermostat, and the homeostasis of room temperature is reestablished. That's what's called a feedback pathway, and all of the different factors our body regulates within these relatively narrow limits are regulated via feedback pathways that work remarkably similar to the way the thermostat in your house works. So we have follow along 1. Now we're kind of delving into follow along 2. What are the mechanisms of regulation? Well, there are 2 basic mechanisms of regulation. There's what's called autoregulation. I tend to use intrinsic regulation. Those are automatic responses in a cell, tissue, or organ to some environmental change, meaning that the nervous system or the endocrine system aren't involved. These are localized responses to changes in the local area or the local system. Extrinsic regulation has to do with regulation that's mediated by either the nervous system or the endocrine system. In fact, when you think about our 2 systems of homeostasis, we refer to every organ system plays an important role or a critical role in maintaining homeostasis, but there are 2 that we refer to as primary systems of homeostasis. And those 2 primary systems of homeostasis are the nervous system and the endocrine system. Now, the nervous system, which consists of the brain, spinal cord, and nerves, is a system of homeostasis because it's capable of detecting, processing, and responding to changes, and it can respond to changes by telling other organ systems what to do. So when a bus is coming at you, for example, you have visual information that comes in, it's processed in your brain, and your brain activates and it sends messages along nerves that tells skeletal muscles, hey, you got to contract in order to get out of the way of this bus. So systems of homeostasis are capable of detecting, processing, and responding to changes, and they're able to do this because they can tell other organ systems what to do. So my skeletal muscles don't tell my brain what to do. My brain tells my skeletal muscles what to do. And that's why we consider, for example, the nervous system to be a system of homeostasis. The endocrine system has very similar capabilities. It can detect, process, and respond to changes. So, for example, when blood glucose concentrations in your blood get too high, that's detected by beta pancreatic cells. That information is processed in beta pancreatic cells, and they affect change by releasing a hormone called insulin, which will bring your blood glucose levels down. It brings your blood glucose levels down by telling fat and muscle, hey, you got to suck up glucose because there's too much in the blood. So those hormones tell other organ systems what to do. Whenever the nervous system or the endocrine system is involved in any feedback pathway we're going to go over in this class, we refer to that type of system of regulation as being extrinsic regulation. So our two primary systems of homeostasis are the nervous system and the endocrine system. Anytime the nervous or the endocrine system is involved in any feedback pathway, we call that extrinsic regulation because it's an organ or a tissue being regulated externally. And the reason why we call the nervous system and the endocrine system primary systems of homeostasis is because they're capable of detecting, processing, and responding to changes specifically by telling other organs and organ systems what to do. That is a unique capability of these systems, and that's what makes them so interesting. So when we think about our two primary systems of homeostasis, nervous system, endocrine system, detect, process, and respond to changes. Now, when you think about homeostasis, again, it's like a high wire act. So this, when it says level over time, this is just any physiological variable. It's representative of any physiological variable. So it could be body temperature, it could be blood glucose concentrations, it could be blood volume, it could be electrolyte concentrations, right? And we regulate these things over time. Now you'll notice that these factors like body temperature, blood pressure, blood glucose levels, they're never exactly at one point. They're constantly fluctuating, so they get high, the body brings them back down. They get low, the body brings them back up. And when we think about what maintains this, how this happens, it's via a system of feedback mechanisms called negative feedback. So for example, if body temperature gets too high, the body works to bring it back down. If it gets too low, the body works to bring it back up. And body temperature, blood glucose, any of our physiological variables, any of these things we maintain within relatively narrow limits, they're constantly fluctuating from high to low, but they never deviate too much in a healthy individual, because if you start deviating outside of these ranges, that's disease. Deviations from homeostasis are disease. So these variables are constantly fluctuating around a fixed point, right, that we refer to as a physiological fixed point. And you'll notice here that when things get too high, negative feedback works to bring them back down. So if body temperature gets too high, we work to bring that body temperature down. If it gets too low, we work to bring that body temperature back up. So what does that mean by negative feedback, and why do we care about this as potential clinicians? Well, when you think about vitals, right, what you take on every patient every time they walk into the hospital or into your clinic that gives you a lot of important information, what you're really talking about is the maintenance of homeostasis, and you're looking at specific variables, specific physiological variables that we maintain within relatively narrow limits. Now, whenever you're thinking about diagnostics, like lab diagnostics, you look at the parameter that's being measured. So in this case, we'll say body temperature, and you look at the reference range. So reference range is between 97.8 and 99.1 degrees. If body temperature is ever lower than 97.8, it means it's too low, and that's a condition called hypo, meaning below, thermia, meaning temperature below normal. If it's ever above 99.1, for example, if you have a fever, that's called hyperthermia, right? A body temperature that's too high. And a body temperature that's too low or too high gives you important information about your patients, right? So we take these vitals to see if there are deviations in key physiological variables or physiological parameters, like body temperature, right? Heart rate, respiratory rate, blood pressure. And you always know your reference range. Where should that be? So if we're thinking about temperature between 97.8 and 99.1, the 99.1 represents the high point, and the 97 represents the low point. And then right in the middle, you have 98.6 degrees, which is what body temperature, quote unquote, should be. That represents a physiological set point that's common in most individuals. So when you think about where the physiological set point for any one of these is, it's often right in the middle. And you can make this graph for any one of these vitals. Right? When we take vitals, what we're looking at is we are looking at systems of homeostasis at work. So if body temperature deviates, if heart rate is 140 at rest, you go, wow, that person's heart is beating really fast. And then you start asking, what's causing that? And if you understand the feedback mechanisms involved in the regulation of heart rate, it reduces the number of potential explanations to just those. And it helps you to make key diagnoses, right? So when we think about chem panel, same thing. So you look at, whenever you're reading a diagnostic test, like a lab value, you always look at the test. So in this case, they're looking at concentrations in sodium in milliequivalents per liter. You look at the patient results, it's 132.5, and then you look at reference range, 142 to 150. 142 would be the low on your graph for sodium, 150 would be the high. And you look at how the patient's value compares to reference range. Well, this patient's sodium values are really low comparative to reference range. So you go, whoa, why would their sodium levels be really low? And you start to ask, well, if I understand the feedback, right, mechanism that regulates the concentration of sodium, I can start to put together an informed, right, guess about that. And then we can do follow-up lab work to figure that out. And in fact, this dude, every single one of these represents a physiological variable that our body maintains within relatively narrow limits. So this dude or gal or whoever it is, or gender non-conforming, I don't care, I don't judge, has a lot of different values off. Some are high, some are low. And you look at that and you go, well, what could raise the creatinine kinase levels or kinase levels in the blood? Now, I know those are supposed to be found in muscle, and if muscle bursts open, those elevate in the bloodstream, and you shouldn't find it at that high. It could be indicative of damage to muscle. Whatever it is, it helps you to make diagnosis. But what you're really looking at when you're looking at reference ranges is you're looking at the high and the low point in your physiological parameter, and that physiological set point exists right in the middle. So we're on follow along 4 now. There are 2 types of feedback that living systems use to maintain homeostasis. There's negative feedback and positive feedback. Now, in negative feedback, negative feedback is defined as a system of feedback in which the response opposes the original stimulus or negates the original stimulus. In other words, if you're looking at a feedback system and the response and the stimulus are opposite of one another, it means that you're looking at a negative feedback system, and the overwhelming majority of physiological parameters like blood glucose, body temperature, heart rate, etc., that our body maintains within relatively narrow limits, most of the feedback systems, the overwhelming majority of feedback systems that maintain these key physiological variables within narrow ranges are negative feedback systems. So if something gets too high, the body works to bring it back down. If something gets too low, the body works to bring it back up. In other words, the stimulus is high, the response is to bring it back low. The stimulus is low, the response is to bring it back up until that physiological set point is reached. Positive feedback, on the other hand, is when the response reinforces the stimulus. So if the stimulus, for example, is contraction of the uterus, then the response would be even more contraction of the uterus. And the only positive feedback mechanisms you need to know for this class are blood clotting and childbirth. So we're going to actually start looking through these different feedback mechanisms, and then I'm going to give you some practice problems to do on your own, but we're going to walk through very similar problems first. So we have 2 systems of homeostasis, nervous system and endocrine system. If the nervous system or the endocrine system is involved in any feedback pathway, we refer to it as being extrinsic. That mechanism of regulation is extrinsic. Now, when you think about the regulation of body temperature, this is a really easy one to kind of conceptualize with respect to how the nervous system works. And once you understand this, it goes a long way to understanding other feedback mechanisms that become important later on down the road. So we have our body homeostasis. Let's say we're at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, 37 degrees Celsius, right? And then you walk outside on a hot Texas day under that Texas sun, and your body temperature begins to rise because it's like 147 degrees out. So your body temperature begins to rise. All feedback pathways start with a stimulus. There has to be some kind of change. So the stimulus in this case would be body temperature rising, and you have sensors peppered all throughout your skin called Thermo Receptors. They're temperature receptors, and those temperature receptors detect that change in temperature, and they transmit that information to a control center. In this case, the control center is the brain, right, which is part of the nervous system. And that information comes in, and the brain processes and makes sense of that change and goes, ooh, man, body temperature is increasing. Now, the brain doesn't change body temperature directly. What it does is it activates an effector. An effector is what actually triggers that change or that response. In this case, the effector would be sweat glands. So the brain sends an electrical signal that travels down the spinal cord along nerves all the way out to the sweat glands in your skin, and they start producing sweat. Now, because the sweat glands are what are affecting the change, we refer to those as effectors. And when that sweat evaporates, it essentially siphons heat off the body or removes heat from the body. It's called evaporative cooling. It cools the body down. And the response is a decrease in body temperature. Because the response is the opposite of the stimulus, by definition, this is a negative feedback pathway. Most of the physiological variables that we look at in this class are regulated via negative feedback, with the exception of childbirth and blood clotting, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So you can then look at this feedback cycle in the opposite direction, right? And how do we warm up? Now, the nervous system is a system of homeostasis. So is the endocrine system. And the endocrine system tends to trick people up a little bit. So we're going to look at the regulation of blood glucose. I've given you the exact opposite, and I'm going to talk about something that's important in just a moment here. So we have homeostasis. Our blood glucose levels are good. Now, we haven't eaten all day because we've been making videos for COVID-19, because we have to transition all our classes online in like a week. So we make these videos and we're not eating or drinking or sleeping. We're just psychotically looking at this screen and talking into it. And nobody's there. Nobody's there. And we have homeostasis, right? But after long enough of not eating, our blood glucose levels are going to start to get low. And you don't want your blood glucose levels getting low because a lot of systems rely on that blood glucose for energy. So you got to bring your blood glucose levels back up. So the stimulus in this pathway is a decrease in blood glucose. Now, that stimulus is detected by a receptor. In this case, the receptors are alpha pancreatic cells. Now, with the endocrine system, right, oftentimes the receptor and the control center are the same, especially if it's a pure endocrine pathway, and we'll talk about that later. So alpha pancreatic cells detect the change in blood glucose. They also process that information and make a quote-unquote decision about what to do. So in response, so the alpha pancreatic cells are both the receptor and the control center, and that's common with endocrine pathways. Now, all endocrine pathways also have another commonality. They release a hormone, right? The effector of all endocrine pathways is going to be a hormone because that's what's going to produce the change. It's this hormone that tells other organs what to do. So the effector in this case is a hormone called glucagon. And glucagon travels to the liver where it binds to receptors in those cells and it says, hey, release some sugar. Liver releases sugar into the blood, glucose levels rise, right? And homeostasis is returned. Because the stimulus, which is a drop in blood glucose, and the response, which is an increase in blood glucose, are the opposite of one another. By definition, this is a negative feedback pathway. So when the response opposes the stimulus or negates the stimulus or is opposite of the stimulus, by definition, you're looking at negative feedback. And this is how you trace this pathway out. Now, On your sheet, I've given you the insulin pathway. Wherever you have a hormone, right, that does one thing, for example, increase blood glucose, you're also always going to have a hormone that does another thing, like decrease blood glucose. Same thing with the nervous system, where you have one pathway that can increase body temperature, you have another pathway that can decrease it. So you have these antagonistic control systems. So I didn't give you the glucagon one. I asked you for the stimulus receptor control center effector target cells in response for insulin. So I want you to think about that, and I want you to think about our two primary systems of homeostasis, and think about those follow-up questions, because justifications are the most important. Why is it a negative feedback pathway? Is it extrinsic or intrinsic? What's unique about the endocrine system and the nervous system that make them primary systems of homeostasis? Positive feedback. Two examples. Childbirth and blood clotting. In the body, positive feedback loops are usually involved in the regulation of potentially dangerous or stressful processes that must be completed quickly. In other words, we use positive feedback when we absolutely have to get something done, when we need to get something done. Childbirth and blood clotting represent imminent threats to homeostasis. We want to get those things over with. So, let's look at the positive feedback associated with blood clotting. Now, we look at this, and I'm just going to kind of simplify this, and I'm going to look at one factor associated with blood clotting. For all of you blood clotting experts out there, we don't get into clotting pathways in this class at all. So, you have your stimulus. Let's say that you have a cut, and that damages the walls of a blood vessel. Those blood vessels will start releasing chemicals, and what it'll cause, right, is a platelet to stick. So you can think of the stimulus here as a platelet sticking. Now the receptors on the platelet are what allow it to stick, and the platelet makes a decision about what it's going to do, right? So it also functions as a control center, and it releases chemicals that activate other platelets. In other words, it releases chemicals that cause other platelets to be more sticky, and what that causes is more platelets to stick. So the stimulus in this positive feedback pathway is platelets sticking. The response is even more platelets sticking. So the response reinforces the stimulus, and those platelets will continue to stick until a blood clot has been formed or until you die. One or the other, right? You use positive feedback when you absolutely positively have to get things done. What type of mechanism would this be? This would be intrinsic or autoregulation. Right? We don't see the nervous system in this specific one, and that's, ignore the complex things you get into in AMP2. We don't see the endocrine or the nervous system directly involved in this. It's the cells in the localized tissues that mediate the response, and as a consequence of that, we refer to this as being autoregulation or intrinsic regulation. So let's take a look at another positive feedback cycle. Baby is growing. Right? So you have a fetus that's growing in the uterus, and that fetus grows and grows and grows. So what actually triggers labor, right? Well, that fetus will continue to grow, and as it grows, it puts stretch on the end of the uterus. The end of the uterus is called the cervix. When the cervix stretches enough, right, which we can actually measure using what's called cervical dilation, but anyway, when the cervix stretches enough, those stretch receptors in the cervix are going to activate, and they're going to fire an electrical signal to the brain. So an electrical signal is going to travel along a nerve to the nervous system, and it's going to be processed by the brain. And the brain is going to go, oh no, the cervix is stretching, and it's going to tell the pituitary gland, so the nervous system is going to communicate with the endocrine system, and it's going to say, hey, pituitary gland, release a hormone called oxytocin. Oxytocin is going to travel to the smooth muscle cells lining the uterus. It's going to bind to receptors, and it's going to tell those smooth muscle cells, contract with everything you got. That smooth muscle in the uterus is going to contract, and it's going to push this baby further into the cervical canal. As it gets pushed into the cervical canal, the cervix stretches even more. So although you don't have to know this in a tremendous amount of detail, the stimulus, which stretch on the cervix, the body's response is to stretch the cervix even more, and the cervix will continue to stretch until this puppy is pushed out. So, and then after the baby's born, right? You think it needs something and you give it to it, and then it just needs more. And it needs more, and then it becomes a kid and it resents you, but it still asks you for things. And then it's an adult and you think that it's going to end, and it just keeps wanting stuff from you, like signatures on a mortgage or a cosigner. It's a positive feedback cycle that never, ever ends. Here's a concept check for you. Take a look at it. Love it, learn it, live it, lead it, lower it. There you go. Have a good day. What, dude? Come on, dude.